All right, ladies and gentlemen, you are Locked On Falcons. I'm your host, Darren Freeman, and today we are talking about the Falcons cornerbacks, arguably the biggest strength of their roster, and whether or not those guys will live up to the hype as one of the league's premier cornerback trios, as well as if the Falcons will discover any depth at cornerback later this summer at training camp.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me. I'm Aaron Freeman, been covering the Falcons for many years, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP, still going strong on Twitter at Falcfans, and of course, the host of this distinguished Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of the Locked On Sports Atlanta podcast family. And like all Locked On Sports Atlanta and Locked On podcasts, you can find Locked On Falcons Monday through Friday, free and available on your preferred podcast platform. And we thank you for subscribing to Locked On Falcons, whether that be on Apple, Odyssey, Google, Spotify, making us your first listen of the day, as well as possibly your first watch of the day, because Locked On Falcons is free and available also on YouTube, and you'll get the video version of the podcast the night before the audio drops. So, guys, today we're talking about the cornerback position. We're doing our positional breakdowns of each position group heading into training camp. And today we'll be talking about the biggest question of the season surrounding whether or not their top three corners will live up to the hype. The biggest question of the summer, which will be focused on whether or not the Falcons will have adequate depth at this position group, which is arguably their strongest as well. And so, the reason why we're talking about this cornerback room living up to the hype, because it was one of the things I mentioned on a previous episode, which may be linked in the card above, talking about sort of Dean Pease installing 100% of his defense. But one of the things we noted about this Falcons cornerback position is that if you look at the PFF grades from last year in zone coverage, the Falcons have arguably the best trio of cornerbacks in the NFL, with Casey Hayward being the second highest graded cornerback in zone coverage, AJ Terrell being top 10, and Isaiah Oliver, despite limited action, was a top 20 corner before he was injured last year. And one of the things we've been talking about on this podcast for the last 6 months is how much of this Dean Pease defense is focused on zone coverage. At the end of the season, Dean Pease said, we got to get better in man coverage. And that led to a lot of people believing that the Falcons were going to be this man heavy and very aggressive scheme. And that's not really the case, right? You don't go out there and sign, Casey Hayward if the goal is to be this man heavy scheme, but it doesn't mean that the Falcons aren't planning on being more aggressive. Again, as that previous episode indicated, we're going to see the Falcons trying to get pressure with four guys, but they're going to be able to bring pressure from different angles, different places, with those sims, with those creepers, right? That's kind of the hallmark of the zone coverage scheme, right? Is you're primarily relying on getting pressure with four guys. And we know that was a major problem for the Falcons due to the conversations we've had already this week in terms of the improvements made in the pass rush. We hope that the Falcons have made significant strides there, but that can be a strength or a weakness of zone coverage. If you can't get reliable pressure with four, it's a weakness. If you can, it's a strength, and we'll sort of see how the Falcons fare in that. The other aspect that we know Dean Pease wants to involve in his offense, and including, being more aggressive and bringing more of those blitzes from different places on the field, is that we know Dean Pease loves to disguise his coverages, right? He wants to give you a different one look pre-snap, one look post-snap, and that can be beneficial to a defense because we know that, it's not as if those quarterbacks don't know what they're seeing, but it causes them to maybe hold on to the ball maybe a split second longer, and that's giving your pass rush more time to get home. So the hope and expectation is that the Falcons will be able to be that top in zone coverage team, but at the same time, they're still going to rely heavily on their man coverage at various points this season in certain situations. And that's primarily on money downs, right? Third down, fourth down in the red zone when you need your defense to get off the field. NFL teams and the Falcons are no different. tend to rely heavily on man coverage in those situations. In the red zone last year, based off of my charting, the Falcons called man coverage on 70% of the red zone plays last year. Outside the red zone, it was only 28%. So it's almost a complete split for 70, 30, 30, 70, depending on where they line up on the field. Third downs, the Falcons, in third and fourth downs, the Falcons called man coverage about 54% of the time, which is significantly higher than what they did on first down. I think it was like 25% on first downs and like 37% on second downs. But, what they call on third downs is heavily dependent on down and distance, right? Third and short, they're calling man coverage. Like in the first 3 games last year, when the Falcons were more running the full extent of Dean Pease's scheme before Isaiah Oliver's injury, right? On third and 7 or less, they ran man coverage 70% of the time. On third and 8 or longer, it was only 10% of the time. So that's one of the differences that we see in the tendencies and schematic tendencies that we'll see manifest itself hopefully this season with more man coverage in those third manageable situations. And we'll see how this trio steps up. Given that we know they're good in zone coverage, and we'll see how good they are in man coverage. One player that we know is really good in man coverage is AJ Terrell, obviously the top corner. I don't have to sit here and spend too much time convincing you that AJ Terrell is good. It was basically a no-fly zone on his half of the field, a UN-sanctioned no-fly zone, and we can't get that in Ukraine because it might start World War III, but we get it every single Sunday in Atlanta with AJ Terrell. And, whether you rank AJ Terrell 1, 2, 10, or whatever on your cornerback rankings, to me is mostly inconsequential. It's really about, do you do your job on Sunday? And we know AJ Terrell did his job as well as any cornerback in the league last year, and we expect that to continue in this 2022 season. But because AJ Terrell's no-fly zone is so good, and no planes are flying on that side of the field, it leads to a lot of footballs being funneled to the opposite side of the field. And we know Fabian Moreau didn't do a great job in that regard last year, although this is a pro Fabian Moreau podcast, because given those circumstances, we grade Fabian Moreau on a curve. He was basically out there trying to tread water, playing opposite one of the league's premier corners, and I thought he did a decent job treading water, but obviously was not necessarily something that was you could write home about in terms of great cornerback play. And that's where Casey Hayward comes into play, the veteran that the Falcons brought in. He's going to be a big upgrade, at least with the expectation is he'll be a big upgrade there. He'll be better able to take advantage of all those opportunities that will be coming his way due to AJ Terrell's presence. And the numbers bear that out that, again, number 2 highest graded zone corner was, basically a lockdown zone corner back, primarily playing in the Raiders zone heavy scheme. And then the Chargers prior to that, they played a lot of cover 3. He'll play a lot more cover 2 probably here in Atlanta, but that shouldn't be a problem for Casey Hayward because he's a very good run defender in that regard. So playing him closer to the line of scrimmage rather than playing that deep third in the cover 3 should also be very good for him. The main concern with Casey Hayward is how much is left in the tank. He's going to turn 33 at some point in September. And you wonder, okay, he's going to start to lose a step. Now, if you've been paying attention to social media over the last couple of weeks, he was at David Mulugeta, his agent, alongside AJ Terrell and several other Falcon players at his pros week earlier this month. And, based off of him racing against guys like Micah Parsons and others, didn't look like Casey Hayward had lost too much of a step. I think playing in a zone heavy scheme also will allow Casey Hayward to sort of elongate his career and still play at a high level because, the things that deteriorate with age typically is, the speed and the quickness and all those various things. So it doesn't look like that's deteriorating quite yet for Casey Hayward, but if it does, it shouldn't be as big an issue given that the Falcons are playing so much zone. And so that takes care of the top 2 cornerbacks in the league. And this is going to be one of the, potentially top 5 cornerback duos in the league. But then you throw Isaiah Oliver into the mix and you now have one of the premier cornerback trios in the NFL. Isaiah Oliver was very good for 4 games last year prior to his ACL tear. And the question about Isaiah Oliver is going to be how much of that ACL tear is going to affect him. Is he going to pick up where he left off? We know that Isaiah Oliver wasn't the fastest or quickest corner in the league. And so you do wonder if that ACL tear, that knee injury, is going to slow him down even further. And he's going to get dropped into the deep end. Whoever, anybody who will be that nickel cornerback who'll get dropped in the deep end this year. And we'll see how Isaiah Oliver fares with that, because week 1, he's got Jarvis Landry. Week 2, he's got Cooper Kupp. Week 3, he's got Tyler Lockett. Then a couple of weeks later, Deebo Samuel. So he's going to be facing some of the premier slot receivers in the NFL to start the season. So if he's not, where he was a year ago, that is going to present some issues for the Falcons. But I'm optimistic that Isaiah Oliver will pick up where he left off. He's exceeded my expectations last year. I defended Isaiah Oliver back in 2020. I was like, hey, he's not as bad as you guys make him out to be. But still, to me, he was better as a nickel cornerback once he made that move about week 5 of 2020 season. But to me, he was just kind of a functional, decent starter, not something to write home about. But last year, at least in the 3 full games that he played last year, he was, arguably a top 5 nickel cornerback. So hopefully, again, maybe he'll be a little bit diminished coming off the ACL injury. But if he's a top 10, top 15 nickel cornerback, that's still going to be more than good enough for the Falcons to accomplish the goals that they want to accomplish defensively, which is going to be that bend but don't break style of defense. That means getting off the field on third downs, where the Falcons were 30th in defensive efficiency last year. Hopefully that improves with better man coverage from Casey Hayward and Isaiah Oliver this year, upgrading what the Falcons had at those positions last year. Better stops in the red zone again, due to that man coverage. The Falcons were 24th last year, so they were decent relative to some of the most of other defensive categories where they were bottom 5 in most defensive metrics. But red zone, they were only the 9th worst, I guess you could say, defense. So that's an area where they can get better. They can be better at creating turnovers now that they have a potential ball hawk like Casey Hayward, who may be able to take better advantage of all those balls that he's seen, lining up opposite AJ Terrell. The Falcons were 20th last year in takeaways. And then we know that the Falcons, the one thing that they were good at last year was not giving up the explosive plays. They were 13th last year in terms of least explosive plays allowed last year. So again, these are areas where the Falcons can get better and be more of that bend but don't break style, leading to overall defensive improvement. Again, as I said on yesterday's episode, you don't expect this defense to be top 10 or top 15, but can they get, to the 20 in the NFL? Can they break out of the bottom 10 where they were like a bottom 3 last year? That would be huge improvement for this Falcon team. And if you can show that growth and then add a top playmaker or top pass rusher at the top of next year's draft, like Will Anderson or Jalen Carter, and you were probably wondering how I would get those references on today's episode about the defensive backs, mission accomplished. And then no, I will not be throwing Arthur Smith in the offense under the bus on today's episode, so he gets a reprieve for the day. But you add another elite pass rusher, maybe get a playmaker at safety next offseason, all of a sudden you're looking at this defense and being like, okay, maybe that's the defense that in 2023 and 2024 can potentially be that top 10, top 15 unit that can help spearhead this Falcons team to potentially making the playoffs, especially if they have to pick up some of the slack that the offense isn't necessarily capable of picking up. And so I guess I did find a way to throw the offense under the bus on today's episode. So we'll see how they fare. It's really about progress that they can show this upcoming season. And we'll see if the Falcons can deliver on that. Now, when it comes to this position group, which most of us agree is the strongest unit on the defense and arguably the strongest unit on the entire roster, you're only as strong as your weakest link. And so that refers to, the depth at this position. And that's going to be the big question of the summer, and whether or not the Falcons are going to find themselves adequate depth through the power of competition in training camp in the preseason. And that's what we're going to talk about as we continue today's episode, guys. But before we get there, you guys know that money can be a little tight, and that can be very stressful when you're, living paycheck to paycheck, worrying paycheck to paycheck. And then when those unexpected expenses come along, that can really throw a wrench into your life and into your plans. I know for me, a lot of that stress is involved with having an older car. I'm hoping to get a new car at some point later this fall. But, in the meantime, those maintenance fees make it very hard when money can be tight if you have to take your car into the shop. But now Dave can get you or me out of those stressful pinches. And Dave is not a person. Dave is a banking app that can help you get up to $500 instantly with extra cash. There's no interest, no credit check needed. Millions have already downloaded the Dave app, and you can too. So go to the App Store right now, download the Dave app. That's DAVE. Sign up for an extra cash account and get up to $500 instantly. For terms and conditions, go to dave.com/legal. Instant transfer fees apply. Banking provided by Evolve, member FDIC. Your future you will thank you. So, as we continue today's episode talking about the biggest question of the summer for the Falcons, we can be in love with the Falcons cornerback trio, their starting cornerback trio, all day, every day. But the concern is what happens if one of those guys tweaks an ankle or injures their shoulder or gets a concussion and misses a game here or two. You can have as great a cornerback, starting cornerbacks as you want, but if your depth isn't good, all right, it throws it out the window. We saw that exact thing happen with the Ravens last year, where Marlon Humphrey and Marcus Peters, arguably the best cornerback trio in the league, but Peters is out for the season, and all of a sudden the Ravens have to throw their entire man-heavy defense away. And I think that's part of the reason, personally, why I think the Falcons don't want to go down that path and be that man-heavy team ideally, but that's a conversation for another day. So we know that injuries occur. They happened quite a bit for the Falcons last year at the position, particularly at that nickel cornerback position with Isaiah Oliver going down. But we saw, Fabian Moreau was time at times, AJ Terrell missed time. And that led to, TJ Green and Chris Williamson getting probably a lot more run than they were certainly capable of performing at. And, no offense to those guys, but it just wasn't good enough. And all of a sudden you went from a decent cornerback room to, a really bad cornerback room, because you had that liability there because you didn't have competent depth there. And so one of the key storylines this summer is going to be whether or not the Falcons, have a competent depth emerge through the power of competition throughout the preseason and whatever the case may be. So currently I'm expecting the Falcons to keep 6 cornerbacks on their 53-man roster. Obviously the 3 guys, AJ Terrell, Casey Hayward, and Isaiah Oliver are locks. You can also throw Darren Hall into the mix as a lock as the Falcons 2021 4th-round pick out of but there's other 2 spots up for grabs potentially. I expect Mike Ford, the free agent pickup, to land one of those spots primarily and exclusively through to his special teams value. I'm expecting Ford to be one of those punt team gunners on the punt coverage unit. But that leaves, one spot potentially for the guy who's going to be the primary backup behind AJ Terrell and Casey Hayward at that outside cornerback spot. And Dee Alford is the guy that I'm penciling in for that spot. Dee Alford's the player that the Falcons brought in from the CFL, had a very good year with the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, and he's the guy that I'm keying on this summer as we head into training camp as the guy that could potentially be that number 4 corner that could be that top backup on the outside. We know that Darren Hall is primarily a nickel cornerback. One of the concerns I had about Darren Hall making his transition from San Diego State to the NFL was I didn't really love him as an outside corner due to some concerns about his lack of size, lack of elite speed. He's not, a 5'9" guy that runs a 4'7" or anything like that, but he's just kind of average in terms of size and speed by NFL cornerback standards. And he's not necessarily the guy that I want covering guys like DK Metcalf and Jamar Chase and DeAndre Hopkins this season as an outside cornerback. I don't think that's going to go particularly well for him. It may not necessarily go well for Dee Alford, but we'll see. I'm a little bit more optimistic based off of what I've seen from him that he may be better fit playing that zone heavy scheme, seems to have the ball skills, seems to see if, that solid play that he had north of the border can come south of the border, even if he's not necessarily significantly bigger or faster than Darren Hall. But you watch his highlights, whether that's at Division II school at Tusculum a couple of years ago or last year in the CFL, where he was the rookie of the year for the Winnipeg Blue Bombers. And you kind of see some parallels between a previous Division II corner that the Falcons had out of Shippensburg that was a practice squad guy, then went overseas, played really well in NFL Europe before coming back to Atlanta and then going on and becoming one of the better cornerbacks of not only Falcons history, but then of the last decade in the NFL. He was on the PFF All-Decade team from 2010 to 2020. And if you don't know who I'm talking about Brent Grimes. And you just get a little Brent Grimes vibes from Dee Alford. And so one of the things I'm intrigued to see if he lives up to that. He doesn't have to be 2011 Brent Grimes or all-decade team Brent Grimes that was a really high-level cornerback for Atlanta, Miami, and Tampa Bay. He just needs to be like 08, 09 Brent Grimes, right? That guy that was like an adequate number 3 cornerback before he really made that big leap forward to be the Falcons' number 1 guy. That's all I need from Dee Alford. Just a decent, backup number 4 cornerback. We can build from that. And then, the future may be brighter than that. But in 2022, all we just need is competent play that in the event of AJ Terrell tweaking an ankle or Casey Hayward or whatever, he can come in for a game or 2 or quarter or 2 or whatever the case may be. And the Falcons defense doesn't completely break because they have a massive liability on that side of the field. So we'll see if Alford can be that guy, and we'll see how he matches up against these NFL wide receivers in the preseason. Speaking of Darren Hall, he's going to be the top backup in that nickel cornerback situation, and I thought flashed some things last year. It was a little up and down as a rookie, but I think a lot of that's owed to the fact that Darren Hall had very little experience being a slot corner at San Diego State, and as he grows and develops, we'll see better play from that. So I'm pretty confident that in the event that Isaiah Oliver does miss more time again this season, Darren Hall will be much better, and there won't be a huge drop off from Oliver last year like we saw last year to Hall and Avery Williams and Richie Grant to Hall and whoever else is in the mix there this year. And then, of course, Mike Ford. All I need to see from him this summer is just to go out there and make some plays on special teams or whatever the case may be. But these guys aren't the only guys competing for roster spots, and we'll talk about some of the other guys that are in the mix to potentially leapfrog some of these guys on the depth chart and be that top backup. And if they are not, the cornerback position may be a position where we see the Falcons looking for more help at the end of training camp before the season with maybe some veteran free agents. And we'll talk about that to wrap up today's Locked On Falcons, guys. But before we get there, I always thank you guys for making Locked On Falcons your first listen. Of course, always recommend what you should check out for your second listen, and always, plug Locked On Sports Atlanta, where you can find, if you subscribe to Locked On Sports Atlanta on YouTube, you can find the Locked On Braves daily postcast breaking down every single Braves win and loss. And we know that the Braves are in the hunt for the pennant right now. As I'm recording this, I think they're down, to the Mets, who they're like a game and a half behind. And so we'll see what they can do, but always recommend second listen to check out Locked On Braves to see what the Braves need to do to catch the Mets and make this, postseason run or whatever the case may be. And of course, you can find Locked On Braves on your preferred podcast platform, whether that be Apple, Odyssey, Google, Spotify, or on YouTube. So, guys, again, really appreciate you guys making Locked On Falcons your first listen. And tomorrow, wake up to Locked On Falcons, because we will be wrapping up the defensive positional previews with the safety position. So go check that out on your preferred podcast platform. But today we'll be wrapping up today's episode talking about the rest of the cornerback room, who, Corey Ballantyne, Cornell Armstrong, Lafayette Pitts, Matt Hankins. These are not guys that I would, at least today, project to be on my 53-man roster. And maybe probably next week we'll get sort of an official projection before all the veterans report the training camp and whatnot. But from me on the podcast. But, part of the reason why I'm not projecting these guys to make the roster is I just don't, to be frank, I don't have that much information or knowledge about these guys. And so that leads to relatively low expectations going to the summer. And we'll sort of see if any of these guys can sort of exceed those expectations. Lafayette Pitts is the player I'm most familiar with just from his days at Pitt. And he was very up and down during his days at Pitt. So I'm not going to necessarily hold my breath that he's going to be that sort of number 4 corner that can overtake Dee Alford. Corey Ballantyne's another guy that I'm somewhat familiar with just because, he was drafted by the Giants a couple of years ago. And the weekend that he got drafted, he was at a party at his local college, and he was shot that weekend, and his best friend was killed in that incident. And that kind of derailed his rookie season. He did get some late season action with the Giants as a rookie, as a nickel cornerback, and wasn't particularly great there, and maybe better suited to being an outside corner. And we'll sort of see if he can kind of get his career back on track this summer with the Falcons, maybe getting a little bit more of those outside corner looks as opposed to being a nickel guy. But the one guy that's probably the most interesting of the sort of back end roster guys, if you want to call them that, is probably Cornell Armstrong. And that's primarily just simply because, at least based off of the various reports and observations made at mini camps and OTAs, he seemed to be one of the guys, along with Dee Alford, that seemed to, stand out to most of those people that were watching those things. So maybe he can give Dee Alford a legit run for his money. And so that's going to be, if beyond Dee Alford, he's probably the other guy that I'm most intrigued by to see what he can do in the preseason and training camp later this summer. And then you also have the undrafted free agent out of Iowa and Matt Hankins, and probably look at Matt Hankins primarily as a developmental guy, probably more destined to be a practice squad guy, but maybe he exceeds those expectations as well. He played in Iowa at that zone heavy scheme that they run, has good size, good length. So seems to check some of the boxes that you want from a developmental prospect, but may not necessarily expect him to come in right away and hit the ground running and make a real run for this roster, and maybe developed on the practice squad for future summers where we can be excited about his potential and developmental potential down the road. So I think the cornerback position is a position where the Falcons are relatively strong, top heavy at this position. And so the focus of this summer is going to be to see if the bottom can kind of rise up, as it were, and see if we can get more proven depth at the end of the summer. And if the answer is no to that, and we see this team struggle and look at some of these backups and say, I don't know if these guys are ready to step in and hold their own, tread water against the DK Metcalfs and the DeAndre Hopkins, which again, I know is a tall order, but you know what I mean. These guys can't step up and at least feel decent that you're not going to basically have to throw away your entire defensive scheme if these guys are in the field. We could see the Falcons, address their cornerback depth with some veterans that may get cut at the end of summer off the waiver wire. And one of the things I do try to keep track of is spreadsheets where I try to list as many players that have previous experience with this coaching staff, because we've seen this trend over the last two off seasons that the team tends to target players that they're familiar with from a coaching standpoint. And there's a couple of guys that I'm looked at some of these 53-man roster projections from various, high profile websites like ESPN and others, and some of these cornerbacks that are in other teams' camps that are on the roster bubble. And you got guys like Bless Austin in Denver. You got a couple of guys in Minnesota from, like Ty Smith and Nate Hairston and Perry Nicholson that have some experience with this coaching staff that are, at least based off of these 53-man roster projections, not expected to make their respective teams. And these guys could be potential targets among, of course, a litany of others. And I'm feeling myself just because, I predicted the Eddie Goldman. So I'll take another shot in the dark here for a possible late August, early September signing with one of these guys potentially. So those are some names to keep an eye on, and we'll sort of keep an eye on that. But obviously the Falcons can avoid that if, a Dee Alford or Cornell Armstrong or one of these other guys step up this summer, and we'll just sort of have to see how that plays out, guys. And that's basically the end of the conversation here with the cornerback room. We know that, or at least we believe that our starters are really good. We have concerns about the depth, but tomorrow we'll be talking about the safety position where it's kind of flipped, right? We know at least the backups in Dean Marlowe, the veterans, and Eric Harris are more known commodities. I'm sure plenty of people have their feelings on whether or not those guys are good, but those guys are the more known commodities, and it's really the starters that are the big question marks with Jalen Hawkins and Richie Grant. And we'll talk about what we can expect from those guys this summer and this season on tomorrow's episode as we wrap up things in these defensive positional previews. We got the special teams breakdown likely coming Sunday evening on the YouTube, as well as Monday morning on your preferred audio platform here as we kick off training camp, where we're only a couple of days away from rookies reporting, where we'll see the Matt Hankinses of the world, showing up next week at training camp. And we'll just sort of see how that plays out, guys, on tomorrow's episode and the coming episodes this week. So if you want to check out, continue the conversation, of course, check out Locked On Falcons. You can provide your feedback to me on a variety of podcasts or on a variety of platforms, whether that's, Twitter or Facebook at Locked On Falcons. You can send an email to lockedonfalcons@mail.com, or you can leave a comment here on the Locked On Falcons YouTube channel, guys. And as always, thank you guys for making Locked On Falcons your first listen. As a recommendation for what your second listen should be, go check out Locked On NFL. And guys, also want to plug the top 50 that Locked On NFL will be doing next week. That is kicking off next Monday, as we'll be breaking down special teams. Make sure you check out the Locked On NFL top 50, where we'll be breaking down. You'll have the various local experts breaking down all 50 of the top most valuable NFL players according to odds makers like BetOnline. That starts again on Monday, July 18th on Locked On NFL, wherever podcasts are available, as well as on YouTube. So guys, that's going to do it for us here today. Tomorrow we got the safeties. Appreciate it. Till then.